morning. I'm going to spend a short bit of time this morning thinking about So this is in Matthew. You'll have to fix this because this ain't working. There we go. So this is a reading from Matthew chapter 19 and verses 13 to 14. Then little children were brought to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray, but the disciples rebuked them. Not the children, the people that were bringing the children. And Jesus said, "Leave the little children alone and don't try to keep them from coming to me, because the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And this echoes his words in the previous chapter where Jesus says, unless you come like a little child, you cannot obtain the kingdom of heaven. That is, become lowly or humble yourself like a little child. Now, it's a weird thing for Jesus to do this. It says, look at children as spiritual examples. Not Moses, not Abraham, not your priests, or your pastors, or your religious gurus, little children. There's something about little children that Jesus wants us to understand when he wants us to think about the spiritual life. Now, why it's weird is because children in the first century had very little status when Jesus was saying these words. They were under the authority of their parents and fathers particularly, and their value was often tied to their future potential, not to their current status. That is to say, children were important because I thought the more children I have, the more they can work the farm, the more they can work in the family business. So there was some future potential, but as little children, perhaps less. And infant mortality was very high in the time, and life was harsh. So everyday practical survival concerns sometimes got in the way of sentimentality. And with Roman influence in Judea, some wealthier Jews might have adopted Roman attitudes where children could be seen as burdens until proven useful. And given the high mortality rate in that environment, you would hope that your children would reach adulthood, but 1 in 3 did not. You kind of got a stoic fatalism. Your kids were loved and important, but at the same time, it was a harsh life, and they were a little less sentimental about children than we are today. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, children are examples of foolishness and flightiness, requiring restraint and firm discipline. Spare the rod and spoil the child is a famously known verse from the Old Testament. You have to break the will of these recalcitrant children. It is a common thought amongst parenting methods even today. The point is that children, as seen and understood by the first century Jews, were important and definitely loved, but never viewed in the sentimental way that we dote on our children today. Given that culture, this is what makes Jesus' call to look at children seem so strange. What Jesus wants us to do is observe children and see them as examples of what he calls as us as adults to be. So let's for a moment imagine a world in which children were in charge. Now, for some of you, it's like that every day at home. The kids are running the show, right? And it's utter chaos. But is it any worse chaos? It's just a different kind of chaos than a world in which people are running, human adults are running the show. It's just a different kind of chaos. So I understand that there's going to be limitations to the thought of children running the world and what that would look like, but bear with me for a moment. What does Jesus mean that the kingdom of heaven is occupied by people who are like little children? So I want to look at 2 ideas here briefly: vulnerability and innocence. Jesus says this: whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever takes a lowly position or humbles himself like a child. Children don't humble themselves. They don't make themselves lowly. That is their general nature. They just are this way. Another way of saying this is that they are by nature vulnerable, small, weak, needy. Children are completely dependent upon adults. They have very little strength. They're easily confused by the events that surround them. They struggle to make sense of the world and are entirely dependent upon the adults in their community. Children, if we believe our Bibles, are little humans created in the image of God, but also very much at the mercy of adults who hold a mighty power and balance over them. Children have no say in the way adults treat them. Now, most of this is benign, and we would say this is often in the best interest of their children. But when you think about it, a child doesn't decide to be born, where he will be born, where he will live, the kind of house he will live in, what school he goes to, what clothes he wears, what food he eats, what kind of music is going on in the house, not for some years until they start to get some agency of their own. And before that, life just happens to them. They don't get a say. And given the great imbalance of power, one of the worst things in the world is the way the world often treats children. And you just think about war. Children don't elect the officials that send the troops to war. They have no say in the politics. They have no say in the place where they live that is being bombed. They didn't make the bombs, adults did. They didn't make the planes, adults did. They didn't drop the bombs, adults did. Adults were the politicians and the governments of the day. Children have no say. And Jesus says we should be vulnerable like children. Now, who amongst us wants to be seeing humility and vulnerability as attributes or strengths? We want to be autonomous and powerful and the master of our lives and all we survey. We want to be take charge kinds of people. We don't want the world to happen to us. We want to happen to the world. But Jesus is pointing to a spiritual truth. This is not the way to life. And this is no way to live. At least it's not the way life was meant to be lived. Although sadly it has become that. God is Father, and we are by nature His children. And so this humbleness, this absence of pride, the removal of cynicism and skepticism that would make us vulnerable are necessary requirements to really see and understand God. To really become a child in the kingdom of heaven. And this means doing really hard, nearly impossible things. Things like putting others first, loving your neighbor as yourself, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Impossibly difficult, vulnerable, humble things. Become like little children. And that, in this world, is insane. Making yourself vulnerable will cause people to exploit you. Now, part of the secret to understanding how we're able to be these kinds of impossibly vulnerable people that Jesus is calling to is to think about the other thing I want to think about, and that's the innocence of a child. We are captivated by the innocence of children. We long for the days when our children viewed the world through non-cynical eyes. Those of you who have parents who grew up, children who grew up, you remember the moment when your child came home with tears in their eyes and they recognized that the world was not the magical place they'd always hoped it would be because her best friend betrayed her, or because he didn't get the role in the play because the son of the principal got the role even though he knew he was better. The world suddenly became an unjust, unfair place. And you remember how your heart sinks when you realize your child has lost their innocence. All of these things that we see, sorry, I've lost my place. For children, every puddle is an ocean of endless possibilities. Every stick is a sword to fight off dragons. Every butterfly a fairy from a faraway land. Every child, no matter their color, was their friend. Racism had to be learned, and they hadn't learned it yet. The lack of caution, because they think surely nothing can hurt me. All of these things point to a world we long for. A world where nothing can hurt us either. All of these things, when we see it in our children, the trust in the goodness of things, when we view the innocence of children, it triggers something nostalgic in us. Because it's something we lose touch with over time. We become cynics and skeptics because we realize the story that we've been born into is not the magical world we'd hoped it would be. A 2023 paper from the American Psychological Association found that adults exposed to quote-unquote innocent stimuli like children's laughter reported higher feelings of nostalgia, but also a fleeting sadness, hinting at a mourning for lost simplicity. We lose something as adults. Innocence and wonder are wiped away. What Jesus is doing here is effectively asking the question, what if the world our children live in is reality, and the world we live in as adults is the fantasy land? What if our children are living the real world, which is the dream, and us adults are living the nightmare. This longing for innocence, this nostalgic feeling, goes far beyond just our own days when we were kids. The Bible is telling a story that goes right back to the beginning, to the Garden of Eden, before sin showed up, and before that wily old serpent tempted our first innocent parents. The nostalgic feeling is the collective memory we all have. An innocent time when we could be vulnerable and nothing could hurt us because nothing wanted to, where everything and everyone was our friend. My contention is that the nostalgic sadness for innocence and its associated vulnerability are a longing for who we really are. And Jesus is reminding us of this. The kingdom of heaven is a place we all long for, a place we all collectively remember, even if we don't realize it. He's putting a name and a nature to it. Real life, kingdom of heaven life, looks like what it is to be a carefree child surrounded by a community of people who want nothing but joy and happiness and peace. Where wonder is the nature of every day, where every day is Christmas and you get that pony you wanted. A place where the bully doesn't win and where the strong don't eat the weak. Now, sure, this is all fantasy, right? It's all pie in the sky and the delusional rantings of some guy who must have an angle. Cynicism always raises its ugly head. We've been taken in too often in the past by snake oil salesmen, and so our defenses are up. But I do ask the question, why would we universally, no matter what color, what creed, what culture, why would we all universally long for a world in which childhood is actually the way it should be if it wasn't possible? If it actually wasn't true? Why is that our universal heart cry? C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity famously said this: "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." Here's the man who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, stories for children, recognizing that children are showing us what our hearts have always longed for because we're made for it. And this is why we desire it. Perhaps a world that our children inhabit may be the real world after all. So I want to finish with these words of Jesus. The question is, how do you restore your innocence, this vulnerability but complete safety? It is, in fact, the reason Jesus came. Let's not make the mistake that those who come to Jesus have the sensibilities of children, that only senseless children and old ladies with dementia come to Jesus. That's not his point. But by coming to Jesus, the restoration of life begins. Real life. The longing for innocence and vulnerability of children begins to find its satisfaction in Jesus. We begin to get a taste of heaven. And it's found not in religion, but in a living relationship with Jesus. Here's the sad reality. Salvatore and his sister Amelia will become cynical and skeptical like the rest of us. And deep down, we just know this shouldn't be. They will lose their innocence and find out how vulnerable they really are, and put up defenses of cynicism and skepticism and harshness to keep themselves safe. And by putting up those walls, they block out Jesus. Which is why we've done this dedication. In the hopes that when the time comes, Salvatore will turn his eyes to Jesus and find that real life is found in the eyes of a child. And these receive the kingdom of heaven.
All right, we've come to our last song of the day.